So thank you very much for allowing me the opportunity to come here today. My name is Nicklas Lundblad. I've worked with Google since 2007 in different roles. I returned to Europe in August last year from a 3.5-year stint in Mountain View, where I worked with long-term research on how technology impacts society. And of course, the subject of today's lecture and the subject of today's conference was one of the things we looked a lot at. Surveillance, privacy, transparency, all of those issues are important and defining issues, I think, for how the information society develops. Now, I also appreciate this because my background is in academia. I did a PhD in informatics, looking at noise societies, and having the opportunity to step back and think a little bit more from sort of a first principles basis about the kind of problems we face is a welcome opportunity in a world that's often driven by the everyday tyrannies of what happens to be highest on the agenda right now. So I'm first going to give you a little disclaimer, which essentially says that these are my own views only. I have a competition going with the lawyers of who can write the most expansive disclaimer. I think I will win. Any other entity, organization, company, or individual is not implied by this presentation. And in order to make it possible for me to sort of speak more widely and broadly and go into the subject, I thought it was important to mention that. Now, what will we do today? Today we will study one question, 4 answers to that question, 3 new complexities that will make the question harder to solve, and then we will look at the 2 challenges that I think we're facing. The question is one that we have been asking ourselves for a very long time, and it's a question that is fundamentally built into the nature of social interaction, and it is, who watches the watchers? It's a really old question. We will track it back in the history of philosophy, and you will see that's been asked over and over again in the history of thought, but it has had and has a new complexity in our age. I'll try to show why I think that complexity is important, and I'll also try to show what I think that complexity consists of. Now, in order to accept the question at all, who watches the watchers, we actually have to agree to a premise, which is that surveillance can be legitimate. I'm not going to debate that premise today, but you can equally debate that as a separate subject, and we can talk about that as well. Now, the premise for this is that an open society that comes together, where everybody gathers to get all of the benefits from social organization, will at some point have to decide how to protect itself, and one part of that protection will then be some kind of legitimate surveillance. Now, if we agree on that premise, we can look at least 4 answers. I would argue there are more, but at least 4 answers that have been given through the history of thought to who watches the watchers. I'm going to start with the answer given by Plato, or actually more accurately given by Socrates, as rendered by Plato in the Republic. Now, the Republic is interesting because it starts from the premise that if we want to become a society, we have to stratify society, and it quickly comes into exactly the problem we discussed. Who will actually then govern and who will protect that society? Plato's answer is the guardians, and the guardians is subdivided into 2 classes. One is the governors, and the other class is the soldiers, essentially. And when it comes to the guardians and who guards the guardians, there's a wonderful section in the Republic that's quite funny, where this man, who is, you can see the likeness, right? This is Plato's older brother, Glaucon. Glaucon is asked at some point what to do if a guardian sort of fails his mission. If a guardian becomes drunk in the street and starts going off the rails, well, how do you handle that? If you have a guardian class and then you have people in general, seems to be a problem there, says Socrates. Glaucon just dismisses that out of hand and says, it would be absurd that a guardian should need a guard. Glaucon completely denies that it could ever be a problem, so he says that the guardians by themselves are actually such patterns of virtue that that's never going to happen. The guardians are, in Plato's Republic, they're philosophers, they're interested in the sort of life of the mind. They only exist on subsistence pay, and they're moderate in alcohol and all of the other pleasures that you can imagine. So why would anybody need to guard them? That doesn't really seem to be the way that society since evolved. So I think that the answer that Plato gives, which is still an interesting answer, is that the answer to who watches the watchers is that through education we are going to create a better kind of human that does not need to be watched. Clearly that answer is provocative even today. When we hear that, we sort of the people who are watching us are a better kind of human. I don't think anybody really agrees with that. And one man who viscerally disagreed with this was this man. You know what this is? This is Roman author Juvenalis. Juvenalis was famous for writing satires, and he is also the one who actually gave birth to the Latin version of Who Watches the Watchers, Qui Custodiet Ipsos Custodes. And it comes from one of the satires in which a husband is trying to keep his wife's morals under check. So essentially what he's trying to figure out is, how can I make sure that I can trust my wife? It's very much about control. And he gets all kinds of advice in this satire, and one of the pieces of advice he gets is this: I hear always the admonishment to my friends, bolt her in, constrain her, but who will guard the guardians? The wife plans ahead and starts with them. So in Juvenalis' world, it's quite clear that the guardians are not better humans, right? They can be corrupted. And the guardians are there to control behavior, but they can be corrupted. That seems to create a problem, because then if you put more guardians towards the problem, then you end up with what is in philosophy referred to as an infinite regress. You will have to have guardians that guard the guardians that guard the guardians, so on ad infinitum. Now, that usually doesn't work out well, and Juvenalis' answer is, you know what, it cannot be done. There is no one that can guard the guardians. So we're stuck with corruptible guardians and a society in which we are going to be watched by the watchers without being able to control it. Sort of the pessimistic counterpoint of Plato, where Plato says, don't worry about the guardians, they're good people. Juvenalis says, no, they're inherently bad people and there's nothing you can do about it. Not a very uplifting conclusion, but that's sort of where he ends up. There's of course a middle ground to be navigated between these two, and I think one of the most interesting versions of that is from Nobel Prize winner Leonid Hershowitz, whose name I'm most surely mangling. He studied a slightly different problem of this, and he said, who enforces the rules against the enforcers? Who makes sure that the people who have the power to enforce rules, the people who have the power to watch society, are actually held to those same rules? Sort of a due process question. He says that this is the fundamental social challenge in any society. Figuring this out is essential to whether or not your democracy will develop and flourish, or whether it will ultimately fail. Hershowitz has two answers to this, and I think his first answer is the most interesting one. And it sort of goes to some of the things we might discuss today. Hershowitz posits that in any population, there are interveners. And what are interveners? Well, Hershowitz says, well, essentially, there are people who, just because they believe that something is right, will try to hold everybody else to it. And he admits that it might not be true that there are interveners, people who will do things like try to keep to the rules even though it will disadvantage them, or hold themselves accountable to the rules. But he says there's a good chance there are interveners in our society, and that is enormously important to, in different ways, encourage. Judge Dredd is a kind of intervener, I guess. But people who genuinely want to do what is right is one answer to the question of who enforces the rules against the enforcers. We're back to Plato, but a version of Plato in which we admit that, yes, there's a large set of corruptible guardians, but you only need to have a small portion of them who are actually right-minded in order to be able to watch the watchers. You don't need all of the watchers to be moral, you just need a subset of the watchers to be moral. Hershowitz' other answer is one that Plato, of course, and Juvenalis did not have accessible to them, and that is the electorate. So in Hershowitz' other answer to the question of who enforces the rules, he says that in an open democracy where information is available at an equal basis, the electorate will be able to vote those corruptible guardians out. So his answer is altruism, because I argue that the interveners are acting out of a kind of altruism and accountability in front of the electorate. So how have things evolved since Hershowitz wrote his Nobel Prize lecture about enforcers? Well, there's been a number of different developments, but perhaps the most important one is the development of information technology. And early on, in the I think it was 1998, this man wrote a book that also had to do with who guards the guardians. This man is David Brin. He is a professor of physics and science fiction writer, and he wrote a little book called The Transparent Society. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. It's an enormously provocative book. It's sort of, its thesis, we'll soon come to that, is that essentially what he says is that, look, in the future there is going to be a lot of surveillance technology everywhere. And the choice you have is not one of whether or not you have the technology or not, because that will just be there. The choice you have is who has access to the data produced by those technologies. And he says there are essentially two paths we can go down. The first is that there will be only a select, limited elite that has access to the data collected about everyone. Second answer is everyone could have access to that. It's questionable if this is really transparency, because what Brin is arguing, and he admits this, is that there's a model in society that can be used as a kind of template for building this new accountable society that he wants. And that model derives from this man. This man is Jeremy Bentham. Everything we need to know about him is that in his free time, when he came home at night, he was a lawyer, he would usually do things like sit down and design prisons. Anyone who does that seems to have an interesting set of hobbies. One of the prisons he designed was this. You see the design is very clear. The cells are around the walls. There's a watchtower in the middle, and you probably heard its name several times. This is actually from Cuba, where they built this actual prison, in Modelo, I think. And it's a version of what Bentham called the panopticon. Now, the panopticon provides, according to Bentham, the advantage of allowing a single guard to watch all of the prisoners, and only if they're watched, he says, only if they're under the gaze of the watchman do they behave well. So Bentham also has a corollary to who watches the watchers, where he says that we need to be watched, otherwise we don't behave. Brin's solution is to take this model for a prison and turn it into society. So is this transparency? I would argue not. There's a better word for it, and the debate around Brin's book, the word equivalence, where everybody surveils everybody else equally, has been launched. So the answer from Brin's side is everyone watches the watchers because everyone's a watcher. So we have these four different answers. We have Plato, who says, don't worry about the guardians, they're good people. We have Juvenalis, who says, you're never going to be able to do anything about the guardians. We have Hertzwitz, who says, well, there's going to be a small subset of the guardians you can trust. Encourage them and then build a strong electorate. And then you have Brin, who essentially says, well, modern technology allows everyone to watch everybody else. And that's the solution to who watches the watchers. I think neither of these four answers, any of these four answers, are sufficient or, even necessary. I think that the choice to build your society into a sort of large-scale prison is definitely an architectural choice that we can make or choose not to make. I think that it's fair to say that that none of the answers that we have sort of surveyed gives the whole picture. And one reason for that is that we're facing a number of new complexities as we move into the information society. The first complexity, and these complexities, they change the nature of the question. They make it more difficult to answer, I would argue. The first complexity is data growth. The amount of available data is growing enormously quickly. This is a quote from the BBC, and I love this quote because it starts with how much data is there, and then the answer is nobody really knows. And I can say, working at a company that kind of cares about these things, that it's probably true. Nobody really knows how much data there is out there, because there are databases that are hidden, there are databases that are open, there are databases that are on the web. There's a tremendous amount of data. So instead of trying to figure out how many exa something bytes are out there, it's good to ask yourself the question, at what rate does the available amount of data double? So if you have one hard drive today, how long does it take for you to get 2 hard drives of data? And the answer today is 18 months. And that's the most conservative answer. Which is, in 1.5 years, the amount of available data doubles. The more aggressive calculations say that this is increasing in speed, and in 2 or 3 years, we will end up in a situation where the amount of data available or stored every year doubles every 72 days. The amount of digitally stored knowledge, information, and data doubles every 72 days. That's fast. So we have an enormous amount of data, and we also have an enormous amount of new data. Because what is happening is that technology is evolving to give us access to more new kinds of data. And there's something here that's quite interesting. It's called the Heidegger Conjecture, which sounds a little bit like a thriller book, but it's not. So the Heidegger Conjecture goes from Martin Heidegger's philosophy of technology, in which he said that what technology does is that it frames things and turns it into data. When we develop new technologies, what happens is that it turns it into data. We get a pulse sensor, and suddenly pulse, something that was not available to computers or available to be stored, can be stored and collected. Where we get, tiny gyroscopes in our phones, and suddenly the phone can tell you what direction you're going, and that direction used to be something that couldn't be captured, but can now be captured. So the Heidegger Conjecture says, well, technology is going to continue to develop that way, and it's going to make the world available as data. And we see this today. There's a very simple example, and that's sensors. The sensor evolution right now is really interesting because your typical phone will have 7 or 8 different sensors in it. It will have all kinds of, it can have a compass, it can have, the gyroscope, it can have a GPS, all kinds of sensors. And that number is growing quickly, and the price of sensors is actually, I think it's the one technology that drops fastest in price of all. Which means that we get data on humidity, we get data on temperature, we get data on salinity of water, because we can have sensors everywhere. And so the Heidegger Conjecture says not only do we get more data every 18 months, we also get a broader set of data, and the world is made available as data. That complicates our question a little bit. Because who watches the watchers is a question also about what they can watch. And if what they can watch expands radically, that's going to be an interesting challenge. There are even biodegradable sensors today that you can use if you're a farmer, and you sort of just put these in your farmlands, and they will tell you about the pH value of your soil. It will tell you about if it needs water or not, and they will sort of beam that back to your phone. Your entire farm is captured as data. It's kind of interesting. And then over time, it degrades. Now, so that's the first complexity when it comes to who watches watchers. The second has to do with the nature of the watchers and how they make sense of this enormous amount of data. And the second complexity is machine intelligence. We have sort of become complacent, I think, or become habituated to the fact that we can do pretty amazing things when it comes to imitating intelligence or solving really difficult intelligence tasks. This is Watson, a computer that won Jeopardy against the human contestants. So this is the first time, so computers can beat us easily in chess, but the more interesting challenge was, can the computer beat us in Jeopardy? The answer, as you can see by the numbers, is very clear. It beat both of the contestants, even if you add their gains. And I love the guy on the left who was the reigning champion. The question was, so who wrote Dracula? And the answer was, who is Stoker? And he says, who is Stoker? And then in parentheses he writes in small lines, I for one welcome our computer overlords. It's kind of cute. So we can do a lot more with artificial intelligence, but what we can do, and what even Jeopardy did, or what Watson did in the Jeopardy case, is faster correlations. So we have this enormous set of data, and we can say, oh, that data seems to vary or correlate with that data over there. Those two things seem to be related. Maybe I can learn something from that. That is complicated, though, because not all correlations are meaningful. One of my favorite websites lately is a website called Spurious Correlations. If you haven't seen it, I can strongly recommend it. It's brilliant. It takes 2 different data values, and it shows that they correlate. And they say, oh, if these correlate, there has to be something there, right? One must be causing the other in one way or another. It's a way for you to start thinking creatively about the fact that correlation might not be causation. And this is one of my favorite examples. This is the people who drowned after falling out of a fishing boat and the marriage rate in Kentucky. Correlation, 95%. Has to be something there, right? No, not really. So the fact that we get faster at correlating things doesn't necessarily mean that we generate more knowledge. In fact, Nicklas Nassim Taleb has made another very interesting point that is kind of worrying, and that is that in very large data sets, large deviations are vastly more attributable to noise, things like the thing we saw in the marriage rate case, than to information. So, he concludes, falsity grows faster than information. So the watchers get all of this data, and they have all of this machine intelligence at their disposal, but falsity grows faster than information. So we risk ending up in a sort of post hoc ergo propter hoc society. This is Latin for a logical mistake that assumes that this happens after this, therefore this happens because of this. That's what it literally says. In science circles, you've probably seen CINAC. Correlation is not a cause. That two things are correlated does not mean that they're related. So machine intelligence provides us with enormously fast ways of finding what looks a lot like evidence, but might not be it. So the way the watchers watch, not only what they watch, the data set, but the way they watch expands in a way that is less and less reliable as the data sets grow. That's kind of interesting too. So the third complexity is asymmetric threats. So the watchers obviously are watching to keep society safe. The nature of the threat that they're watching for, therefore, I think, has a certain impact on, a certain very large impact, I would argue, on their ability to succeed. So this man, Nick Bostrom, has spent a lot of time thinking about what happens with threats in a modern society. And his conclusion, simple, although chilling if you think about it, is that our individual ability to cause harm is increasing enormously fast. What does that mean? Well, it means that I can, with a fairly simple chemistry set, create all kinds of really, really strange things. And with access to the web and access to a slightly more complicated chemistry set, I can actually start designing viruses. So my ability to cause harm is increasing. And we just said that the data sets are growing, so that should mean that detection is harder. So the problem we're facing, or seem to be facing when it comes to threats, and this also makes it more difficult for solving our question, who watches the watcher, is this. It's a growing haystack, shrinking needle problem. So we always hear people saying that, well, we're looking for a needle in a haystack, and therefore we look to, we need to gather all of the hay. The problem is slightly different. The problem is that the haystack is growing at a breakneck pace, and the needle you're looking for is shrinking. So your ability to find it is probably going to be much lesser, which actually allows us to ask the question about the efficiency of watching, and if the watchers really can watch in a way that is meaningful. What this also leads to, which is kind of interesting, is that the strategy is deployed by the people who do not want to be detected, because the needle in the haystack has a will of its own. It's not very happy about being detected by people. So the strategy here has become something that is somewhat, well, might be a misnomer, but it's sort of what it's been called. It's Nietzschean noise. Nietzsche said in one of his aphorisms that to speak a lot about oneself is also to hide oneself. A whole world of computer science is devoted to exploring this. It's steganography, which essentially means information hiding. Rather than encrypting your message and locking it in a little box and saying, haha, here's my secret box. Because having a secret box is something that everybody sort of reacts to nowadays. In fact, sending an encrypted message, some of the security agencies revealed, is a major flag. Because you're encrypting something, you're hiding something. Now, the people who use steganography instead, what they do is that they say, well, you know what? There's a fair bit of information out there. What if I make my information look like something innocuous? What if I hide it rather than encrypt it? And that is quite possible to do. So take just one super simple example. This is a service on the web that anyone can use called Spam Mimic. What it does is this. It allows you to take any message, the key is in the shoe, click encode, and it turns it into spam through a very simple linguistic transformation. And then you take the spam and you send it, and suddenly the security agency has to go through all the spam on the web. Good luck with that. Somebody gets it. They know that they're supposed to get it at a certain time or something else that sort of signifies that it's not spam. They encode it back, and suddenly they have access to it. So summing up then, we have three complexities that I think are fundamentally changing the nature of the question, who watches the watcher. The data growth we spoke about, both in size and scope. Machine intelligence that does allow us to make faster correlations, but we should ask the question about the quality of those correlations. And then the growth of asymmetric threats that seem to imply that you're looking for a shrinking and slightly evasive needle. So who watches the watchers? I think this question now leads us to two challenges that we have to grapple with. And they're not easy challenges, but I'll explain why I think they're important. The first is responsible transparency. And responsible transparency, and this is something that sort of goes to the title of our conference today, responsible transparency is transparency that speaks about what the watchers are watching. As we said, do they know if they're watching correlation or causation, for example? What's the data quality they're watching? Who are the watchers? We should be told which agencies in a society actually have the right to engage in surveillance. We should figure out also if the watchers are giving information to each other, because that can, of course, become very quickly a game of telephony. And then who are the watchers watching? Classical problem notification. If you are the subject for surveillance, should you not then be notified at some point? And then when are you watching? The problem authorization. What triggers allow you to watch? And then why? Oversight and accountability. Questions that we've sort of seen grow. Now, in addition to all of this, we need documentation and reporting. And the reason we need this, I think, is that I believe that Hertzford is right in saying that an informed electorate can actually be a check on the watchers. But an informed electorate needs to have access to information about how surveillance is conducted. When I was in Mountain View with Google for a while, we worked a lot on sort of trying to figure out what we could do on our side to sort of just test this, see what kind of sort of trust technologies we could develop, for lack of a better word. And so we did something called the Transparency Report. And the Transparency Report essentially gives you information about all of the governments that come to us and request information about users or request us to remove content. So typically we would then give you statistics, we would tell you how this is evolving. The statistics on the left is the amount of requests that we get, user data requests in this particular case, and the statistic, the sort of the chart on the right is the number of our compliance percentage. It's going down slightly, which seems to indicate that the quality of the requests are sinking. And then you could also go to individual countries. So you could look at France, for example, and you can see how your country, if you're interested in this, if you're part of the French electorate, how your country is using the rights conveyed to it by its citizenry to watch or engage in surveillance. We also did a traffic graph that shows when any of our services are blocked. This is Turkey. You see what happens on the 28th of March. And you can then see that the capacity is cut in half through different kinds of filtering. We have this for all of our different services. Now, this is an interesting project. It's been developed by a gang in Chicago that is really committed to and passionately interested in trying to figure out how we can provide more information about how our services are under different circumstances, controlled by or accessed by others. Now, it seems to me that if we go back to who watchers to watchers, surely governments could do this too, right? Why should they not try to produce a transparency report, say, every half year, every quarter, and just tell the citizenry, this is how we're using the powers you've entrusted in us to protect our society? It seems to be a no-brainer. It seems to be something that they can engage in easily, and that would definitely allow us to have that informed debate that Hertzford says is an absolute prerequisite in order to get to the right balance. And that is the second challenge, I think. We need to be striking a balance. We need to be figuring out what level of surveillance we believe is right for an open society. My 5 Swedish krona is citing Karl Popper, who said we must plan for freedom and not only for security, for no other reason that only freedom can make security more secure. Unfortunately, pithy quotes like this won't help us strike the balance. We need to sort of go deep and figure out how we can find at least principles. We have been part of something called the Global Government Surveillance Reform, and that's a series of companies. And it's been criticized rightly, I think, in some sense, for just being a series of companies. It should be expanded. What we have done is that we have developed a number of different principles limiting surveillance that we think are reasonable from our perspective. The principles are here. It's limiting government's authority to collect users' information first, oversight, accountability, transparency, respecting the free flow of information, avoiding conflicts among governments. There are plenty other principles too, which I think is a good thing. One of my favorite ones to sort of debate and discuss is this. And you've probably seen this before. These are the necessary and proportionate principles. There are more of them. They go through legitimate aim, necessity, adequacy, proportionality. They look at competent judicial authority, due process, user notification, we spoke about that, transparency, and then public oversight, integrity of the systems, you cannot compromise the security of the systems, safeguards, etc. What we need here is an open debate, where we look at these principles, where we try to break them against each other, and where we figure out how we can get the information that Hertz said would allow us to put checks on the watchers. So that's one question, 4 answers, 3 new complexities and 2 challenges. Thank you.